Hi everyone, let's go ahead and take a look at section 3 of chapter 21, and this is looking at those primary lymphatic structures that we just discussed in the last video, which is going to be the red bone marrow and the thymus. So remember what we talked about with the primary lymphatic structures is their main function is, this is where those lymphocytes are going to be formed and where they're going to mature. So remember the two major types of lymphocytes that we are going to look at are going to be T cells and B cells, or T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. Please remember that you can use those interchangeably. So they are going to be born or formed in the same place, but as far as where they mature, they are going to be a little bit different. So let's go ahead and take a look first at the red bone marrow. The red bone marrow, we know red bone marrow, right? We talked about that in the blood chapter when we talked about hemopoiesis, hematopoiesis. Remember that the red bone marrow is going to be where red blood cells are formed, white blood cells are formed, and platelets. Since we're talking about some white blood cells, then we know that this is where T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes are going to be formed, is here in the red bone marrow. So remember, red bone marrow is going to be found in spongy bone, like the approximately epiphyses of long bones, flat bones, like the ribs and the skull. What else? The vertebra. They're found there, pelvic bones as well. So that's where you're going to find those red bone marrows, or red bone marrow. What else? All right, so from here, so after they're born in the red bone marrow, they are going to mature in very different places. The B lymphocytes are going to stay in the red bone marrow, and this is where they are going to mature, those B lymphocytes. So just think B bone marrow, that's where they are going to mature. That's not where the B comes from, but you can just kind of think that way. That's where they're going to mature. Now, the T lymphocytes are going to be very different. They are going to be born in the red bone marrow, or formed, I guess I should say formed or born, whichever one you want to think of, in the red bone marrow, but they leave the red bone marrow when they're immature. They're called pre-T lymphocytes or thymocytes. I've also seen that used. I don't know if the book uses that term, but I've seen thymocytes being used. But these pre-lymphocytes, these basically immature lymphocytes, are going to go to the thymus, and that's where they are going to go to mature. So very different places where they mature. B lymphocytes stay in the bone marrow to mature, and then the T lymphocytes are going to go to the thymus to mature. That's where they are going to migrate to. Once they're mature, they are going to be put into the circulation, and eventually both of them, once they're mature, are going to go to those secondary lymphatic structures, and they are going to just hang out in places like the lymph nodes or lymph nodules or spleen, any of those secondary lymphatic structures, and they just wait to be presented with a pathogen, or presented with an antigen, I guess I should say. We'll get into pathogens and antigens later on once we get into the immune system. So that's the red bone marrow. Let's go ahead and take a look at the thymus, since we are looking at primary lymphatic structures. So the thymus is going to be where T cells mature. So it's kind of like they're being kicked out and they're being sent to boarding school to mature, because they can't mature at home where they were born. Just taking a look at location, it is going to be right there above the heart, kind of superior to the heart. Also anterior to that trachea, and also, of course, portions of the lungs as well, really depending on if you're looking at the child or an adult. Look what happens. So if we take a look at the size, the infants and young children are going to have the largest thymus, and right around puberty is when it's going to start to atrophy. And what happens is a lot of the tissue of the thymus is going to be replaced by connective adipose tissue. And then eventually it's going to be very small as we're adults. So it actually atrophies over time. And we'll talk about that atrophy a little bit later when we kind of look at what is happening with T cells once we get into the immune system. So let's go in and dive in and take a look at the microscopic portions of the thymus. Before we do that, let's look at the outer part. There's two lobes you're going to have, and they're going to be fused in the middle. And then if you kind of take a look a little bit closer, you see how it looks a little lumpy. If you kind of blew up the picture, you'll be able to see it. Those are lobules. So it's going to be broken up into, you can see a little bit better here, the different lobules. And then if we kind of zoom in on a lobule, this is going in and looking at different lobules as well. We'll take a look at another picture. But if you take a look at the lobules, look, it's going to have kind of a darker portion, outer portion, and that's going to be the cortex. And then it's going to have a lighter middle portion, which is going to be the medulla. So this is very similar to what you saw with the adrenal gland as far as having that cortex and the medulla. This is what it looks like under the microscope with an adult. Look at all of that connective tissue, all of that clear portions right here is going to be adipose connective tissue. So it's replaced by fat. You just have a little bit of thymic tissue left as you get older and you're an adult. So let's kind of zoom in a little bit more and look at the cortex and the medulla. Again, you're looking at lobule, we're looking at a lobule here, we're looking at a lobule here. You have that darker portion, that's the cortex. What we find here in the cortex is going to be immature T lymphocytes. So when they leave the red bone marrow and come over to the thymus and mature, they are going to be in this cortex right here. And when I say that they have to go through this maturation, what I mean is that they have to go through a series of tests. They have to make sure that they know what self cells are, cells that belong in our body, and non-self or foreign cells. So they have to go through that whole test. And then they have to go through a test of being able to recognize their actual antigen that they're responsible for. So we'll take a look at that whole process and the immune system. But that's what's going on here in these lobules, is going through those tests. So the immature ones are going to hang out in this cortex. And once they become mature, they are going to move here into the medulla. And eventually, they are going to go to one of those secondary lymphatic structures where they are just going to hang out and wait for an antigen. That's all they do in those secondary lymphatic structures. Now, the way that they mature, one thing that's going to help them mature are thymic hormones. Remember I mentioned how the thymus secretes hormones back in the endocrine chapter, and here we are, these thymic hormones. You have things like thymosins and thymulin, several different thymic hormones that are going to help with this whole maturation process. So the next section we're going to be taking a look at is the secondary lymphatic structures. We're going to take a look at where the T cells and B cells go once they're mature. We're going to take a look at those structures. So until next time.